Picture a man standing in a river valley about 9,000 years ago. He is 25 years old. He is not weak. He can walk 40 kilometers in a day, carry a deer across his shoulders, throw a spear hard enough to drop a boar. If you put him next to the average person alive today, he would be leaner, stronger, and almost certainly tougher. One afternoon, pushing through a thicket, a thorn opens a shallow cut across the back of his hand. He barely notices it. He wipes it on his thigh and keeps walking. 4 days later, the hand is swollen to the wrist. On the 6th day, red lines are climbing his forearm. On the 9th day, he is burning with fever and cannot stand. On the 10th day, he is dead. Not old age, not a predator, not a rival tribe. A scratch from a thorn. His family would not have called it bad luck exactly. They had seen it before. A cut on a foot, a tooth gone bad, a woman who never recovered from a birth. Death didn't usually arrive as a dramatic event. It arrived quietly, through a small opening, and by the time anyone understood how serious it had become, there was nothing left to do about it. That was simply what the world was like. This is the thing we get wrong about ancient death. We imagine our ancestors were fragile, that they simply wore out early. They didn't. For most of human history, healthy people in the prime of life were killed by things that are, to us, almost trivial. And the reasons why are stranger and more specific than the number on a chart. You have probably heard the correction already. Someone says people in the past died at 30, and someone else jumps in to explain that this is an average, dragged down by babies who didn't survive their first year. Reach adulthood in the ancient world, the correction goes, and you had a decent shot at your 60s. That's true, and we'll come back to it. But it's also where most explanations stop, and stopping there hides the more interesting question. Because the real question isn't, what does the average mean? The real question is, what actually killed people? Which specific forces reached into an ancient life and ended it? Why couldn't anyone stop them? And why, for thousands of years, did those forces seem almost impossible to beat? When you look at it that way, a pattern appears. Ancient humans lived without 3 invisible shields that we now take completely for granted. The first is a clean, reliable supply of water and food. The second is the knowledge that invisible organisms cause disease. The third is any effective way to stop an infection once it starts. Remove those 3 shields, and a strong 25-year-old and a thorn is a fair fight. We're going to walk through an ancient life from the beginning, and at every stage we'll ask the same question. Here, right now, at this age, what is most likely to kill you, and why can nobody prevent it? Every ancient life begins with 2 people in danger, not 1. Childbirth without surgery, without sterile hands, without any way to stop bleeding, is one of the most dangerous things a human body can do. If the baby is turned the wrong way, or simply too large, there is no safe way out. Labor that a modern hospital resolves in 20 minutes could last 2 days and kill both mother and child. Even a normal birth left an open wound inside the body, and open wounds, in a world that didn't know germs existed, were an invitation. Across many pre-modern populations, something like 1 birth in 100 ended the mother's life. That sounds survivable until you remember that a woman might give birth 6, 8, 10 times. The risk stacks with every pregnancy. A significant share of ancient women died not of disease or age, but in the act of continuing the species. For the newborn who makes it, the next 1,000 days are the most lethal of the entire lifespan. There are no vaccines. A case of measles, or whooping cough, or diarrhea from dirty water is not an inconvenience. It is a coin flip. Weaning is especially deadly. The moment a baby stops drinking its mother's milk and starts taking water and gruel, it loses her antibodies and starts swallowing whatever is in the local water supply. In cemetery after cemetery, archaeologists find a spike of infant graves clustered right around weaning age, and the home itself is hostile. Picture a small enclosed dwelling, with a fire burning in the middle of it and no chimney. The adults have adapted. The infant's lungs are breathing wood smoke around the clock, and respiratory infection follows smoke like a shadow. There's also no safety net of knowledge. A mother watching her baby dehydrate from diarrhea has no idea that a pinch of salt and sugar stirred into clean water could pull it back from the edge. A remedy so simple it can be made in any kitchen, and one that still saves roughly 1 million children a year. Without that single piece of information, a common stomach bug is a death sentence delivered over about 3 days. Multiply that by every household, every year, for thousands of years, and you start to see the shape of the problem. This stage, Birth in the first 3 years is what really sets that famous life expectancy number. It isn't that ancient adults were dropping at 30, it's that so many lives ended before they had properly started that the arithmetic never had a chance. Say you survive to 5. You've cleared the deadliest gate. Now you enter a phase that rarely kills quickly, but quietly shapes and shortens everything that comes after. Childhood in the ancient world was a childhood of parasites. Hookworm, roundworm, whipworm, and in some regions blood flukes and the parasite that causes malaria. These were not rare misfortunes. In many settled communities, they were close to universal. Children picked them up from soil, from water, from other children, and then carried a permanent internal tax. Worms in the gut siphon off blood and nutrients before the child can use them. The result is chronic anemia, low energy, and a body that grows more slowly than its genes intended. We can see this written directly into ancient skeletons. There are faint horizontal grooves across the teeth, called enamel defects, that form when a child's growth stalls during illness or hunger and then restarts. There are similar arrest lines buried in the long bones of the legs. There is a spongy, porous texture that appears on the skull and in the eye sockets, linked to long-running anemia and nutritional stress. Read a cemetery population carefully and you can count how many childhood crises the average person survived before adulthood, and the number is usually several. Then there is the synergy, which is the cruel part. A well-fed child can fight off a parasite load. A child weakened by parasites can't fight off a bad harvest. Malnutrition and infection amplify each other. Each one makes the other more likely to kill. A dry summer that a healthy population would merely grumble about could, in a population already running on empty, open a wave of child deaths. So the survivors of ancient childhood were genuinely tough. But many of them walked into adult life already carrying damage, shorter than they should have been, with worn teeth, scarred immune systems, and less reserve than they looked like they had. Here is where the story turns, and turns against our instincts. We tend to assume that life got steadily better as humans got more advanced, that farming, villages, and cities were each a step up in comfort and safety. For health and lifespan, the opposite happened first. The switch from foraging to farming, starting around 10 to 12,000 years ago, made human beings die younger, not older, and it stayed that way for a very long time. Compare the skeletons. Hunter-gatherers, on average, were taller. They had strikingly good teeth, very few cavities. Their diet was wildly varied. Dozens of plant species, plus fish, game, shellfish, whatever the season offered. Because they moved, they didn't live surrounded by their own waste. Because they lived in small, spread-out bands, a new disease that appeared in one group often burned out before it could reach the next. Early farmers gave up almost all of those advantages. Their diet narrowed to a handful of staple crops: wheat, barley, rice, maize, depending on the region. More calories, yes, but far less variety, which meant vitamin and mineral deficiencies that a foraging diet had covered by accident. Grinding grain on stone left grit in the flour, and that grit sanded people's teeth down to the nerve. Storing grain-fed rodents, and rodents brought fleas, and some of those fleas carried the bacterium behind plague. Irrigation ditches and rice paddies created still, warm water, perfect nurseries for the mosquitoes that spread malaria. Living permanently in one spot meant human waste piled up next to the same stream people drank from. And then there were the animals. Cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, and poultry, kept close for the first time, in pens beside the house. Living pressed up against herds, in growing numbers, humans created exactly the conditions that let epidemic diseases take hold and stay. Illnesses that need a dense, constant supply of new hosts to survive. Crowd diseases are a side effect of the barnyard and the village. At sites in Anatolia, in the American Midwest, in the Eastern Mediterranean, the pattern repeats. As a population takes up full farming, average height drops, tooth decay climbs, anemia markers increase, and new infections appear. In one well-studied population in the Illinois River Valley, the shift to intensive maize farming lines up with a jump in childhood stress markers, more infections in the bone, and a drop in the age people were reaching at death. People traded the old danger, the failed hunt, the lean winter, for a new one, the epidemic that sweeps a crowded settlement. For centuries, that was a bad trade. It's worth being fair to farming here. It could feed far more people per square kilometer than foraging ever could, which is why it spread and never reversed. But supports more people, and each person lives longer, are different things, and for a long stretch of history they pointed in opposite directions. The population climbed, the individual lifespan did not. There is one more killer from this stretch of history that rarely gets named directly, because it worked so slowly. Hunger. Not the dramatic famine of the history books, though those happened too. The ordinary problem was quieter. A farming community lived or died by a single harvest, and that harvest had to last a full year. If it came in short, a late frost, a dry spring, a hailstorm at the wrong moment, a plague of insects, there was no supply line to make up the difference. You could not bring in grain from a region that had done better. You ate less, and then you ate much less, and you waited for spring. And even in a good year, there was a hungry season. In the weeks before the new crop came in, last year's stores ran thin. Every year, communities across the ancient world passed through a lean stretch where people lost weight, where the youngest and the oldest slipped closer to the edge. It was normal. It was also, quietly, dangerous, because a body running on a deficit fights off infection poorly, heals wounds slowly, and carries a pregnancy with far less to spare. Stored food was also a target. Grain that a village had spent a year producing could be taken as tribute, as tax, or as plunder in a single afternoon. For a lot of ancient farmers, the only thing standing between their family and a bad winter was a clay silo that someone more powerful could choose to empty. Chronic, grinding undernutrition almost never shows up in the record as a cause of death by itself. It shows up as everything else becoming a little more likely to kill you. Now take someone who beat all of it. They survived birth, survived weaning, survived the parasite years, survived every childhood fever. They're 20, strong, fully grown. What kills them? Overwhelmingly, it's infection, but infection with a specific doorway. Start with injury. In a world of stone, timber, livestock, and hard falls, broken bones and deep cuts were routine. A clean break, splinted well, could heal. But a bad fracture that pierced the skin, or any wound deep enough to trap dirt, put bacteria somewhere the body couldn't flush them out. There were no antibiotics. There was no way to sterilize anything. A farming accident in the morning could become a fatal blood infection within the week, and the bones of ancient cemeteries are full of the evidence. Infections that ate into the shaft of a leg bone, jaws destroyed by abscesses, the telltale twists of tetanus. Then, teeth. And this one genuinely surprises people. A dental abscess is a pocket of infection sitting a couple of centimeters from the brain and from the major vessels of the neck. Today it's a prescription and a filling. In the ancient world, once decay or that stone-ground grit wore through to the pulp, an abscess could swell until it closed off the airway, or leak bacteria into the bloodstream. Rotten teeth were not just painful. They were, with real regularity, a cause of death. Then, the lungs. A lifetime of indoor smoke, and later a lifetime of stone dust, mine dust, or pottery dust, scarred the airways from the inside. In crowded settlements, tuberculosis spread from cough to cough and settled in for the long term, slowly hollowing people out over years. You can find its fingerprints pressed into the inner surface of ancient ribs and the vertebrae of the spine. Then, the water. The same stream serving as a drain also served as the cup. Dysentery, typhoid, and cholera-type outbreaks moved through settlements along the water supply, and they killed adults and children alike, often in days. A single contaminated well could end dozens of lives before anyone understood what a well even was. And running underneath all of it, for women, the danger of childbirth didn't end at one delivery. It returned with every pregnancy, right through the fertile years. What about violence? It was real, and in certain times and places, it was a major killer. Some ancient cemeteries show remarkably high rates of healed and unhealed weapon injuries, and famous individuals like the Alpine Iceman died with an arrowhead in the shoulder. But averaged across the whole ancient world, murder and war were usually a smaller slice of the total than we picture. The microbe outkilled the blade almost everywhere. To see how all of this stacks up inside a single person, it helps to look at the most thoroughly examined ancient body we have. The man who died in the Alps around 33 centuries before the Common Era, preserved in ice and found by hikers in 1991. He was in his mid-40s, which for his time was a genuine achievement. And his body is a catalog of ancient wear. His joints were worn and his spine showed degeneration you'd expect from decades of hauling loads over mountains. His arteries were already hardening. His stomach held the eggs of whipworm, a parasite picked up from contaminated food or water. His gut carried the bacterium associated with stomach ulcers. There is evidence his immune system had met the organism behind Lyme disease. His teeth were worn and decaying, and his lungs were darkened, most likely from a lifetime beside open fires. And after all of that, what actually killed him was none of it. It was an arrowhead, lodged in his shoulder, that severed an artery and left him to bleed out on a mountainside. One man. Parasites, infection, heart disease, bad teeth, damaged lungs, and finally a weapon. That is the ancient medical record in a single frozen body, and by the standards of his world, he had done well to last as long as he did. It would be wrong to picture ancient people simply standing by while all of this happened to them. Every society had healers, herbalists, bone setters, midwives, priests, and some of what they knew genuinely worked. They could set a broken limb and splint it. They could close a wound with stitches. They knew that willow bark eased pain and fever, which is the same compound we now call aspirin. They packed wounds with honey, which really does slow the growth of bacteria. Some cultures cut carefully into the skull to relieve pressure, and the healed bone shows that patients often lived through it. Midwives carried real, practical skill down through generations. But there was a ceiling, and it was low. Nobody could see an infection coming, or stop one once it had started. There was no way to safely open the abdomen, so an obstructed birth or a burst appendix was simply the end. There was no dependable way to control pain for anything major. And a good deal of ancient medicine actively made things worse, draining blood from a patient who needed every drop, or treating a fever by weakening the person who had it. Most of all, the framework itself was wrong. If you believe sickness comes from bad air, or from an imbalance in the body, or from the displeasure of a god, then washing your hands, boiling your water, and keeping the sick apart from the healthy are not obvious moves. The single most powerful idea in the history of medicine, that specific, invisible living things cause specific diseases, and that cutting their path from one person to the next saves lives, was still thousands of years in the future. The healers were often skilled, careful, and doing their best with what they had. What they were missing wasn't effort, and it wasn't intelligence. It was the map. So who made it through? Plenty of people, actually. This is where that statistical correction earns its place. If you cleared childhood and dodged the worst of the adult gauntlet, your 60s and 70s were well within reach. Ancient societies had grandparents. They had elders who remembered 2 or 3 generations of stories, who knew where the water was in a drought and which year the river last flooded. Old age existed, and it mattered. But it arrived early, in the body if not on the calendar. Decades of hard physical work ground down joints and spines. Teeth were lost one by one, and a mouth with few teeth can't process a tough diet, so nutrition slipped, and with poor nutrition came frailty, and frailty made the next infection or the next bad winter the last one. Vision clouded with cataracts that no one could remove. Hernias, kidney stones, and slow-growing tumors that a clinic would catch in an afternoon simply ran their course. So the picture isn't a world without old people. It's a world where reaching old age meant surviving a long series of coin flips, and where, once you got there, the where of the journey was already written deep into your bones. If ancient humans died young because of infected wounds, dirty water, crowd diseases, and unstable food, then the obvious question is, what fixed it? And the popular answer, modern medicine, doctors, hospitals, is mostly wrong, at least about the order of events. Most of the enormous jump in human lifespan happened before medicine had much to offer at all. The first shield to go up was sanitation. In the 1850s, a London doctor traced a cholera outbreak to a single public water pump and had the handle removed. That idea, that disease travels through water, and you can cut it off, did more for human survival than any pill. Cities dug proper sewers, separated drinking water from waste, and death rates fell before anyone could treat a single one of the diseases involved. The second shield was food. Better farming, faster transport, and eventually refrigeration meant that a bad regional harvest no longer meant regional starvation. Famine went from a recurring feature of life to a rare emergency. Better-fed bodies fight off infection far better. So this alone saved millions of lives that never showed up in any doctor's ledger. The third shield was the germ theory itself, not as a treatment, but as a change in behavior. Once people accepted that invisible organisms cause disease, a doctor washing his hands between patients cut deaths on maternity wards dramatically. Surgeons who started sterilizing their instruments and their wounds turned operations from a near-death sentence into something survivable. No new drug required, just the knowledge of what the enemy was. Vaccines came next, turning childhood coin flips into non-events, one disease at a time. And only then, in the 1940s, did antibiotics finally arrive. The first reliable way to win the fight our thorn-scratched hunter lost 9,000 years ago. You can watch it happen in the numbers. For almost the entire span of human history, life expectancy at birth sat somewhere in the 20s or low 30s and barely moved, century after century. Around the year 1800, in the wealthiest countries, it was still under 40. By 1900, with sewers and better food doing their work, it had climbed toward the high 40s. By the year 2000, it was pushing 80. Almost all of that change happened in the last 200 years. A blink, and the earliest, largest gains came from preventing infection, not curing it. The single biggest driver was simply this: far fewer children dying. Take away the childhood slaughter, and the average leaps. It's worth sitting with how recent this is. A person born in the year 1700 lived, on average, about as long as a person born 4,000 years before them. 40 centuries, almost no movement. Then, in the span of 6 or 7 generations, human life expectancy roughly doubled. Nothing about our bodies changed in that window. Everything about the world around them did. Notice the pattern. We didn't out-tough our ancestors. We built the shields they never had: clean water, steady food, and an understanding of the thing that was killing them. Go back to the river valley. The man is 25, and the thorn has just opened the back of his hand. Everything that would save him today is unglamorous. A clean rinse, a tetanus shot he'd have received as a child. If the infection took hold anyway, a 5-day course of tablets. And behind all of that, enough food and clean water for his body to do the healing itself. None of it is strength. None of it is heroism. It's knowledge and plumbing and a supply chain. Ancient humans didn't die young because they were lesser versions of us. They died young because they stood in the open, against an enemy they couldn't see, with nothing between them and it. We're not braver, and we're not built better. We're just the first humans who got to stand behind the shields.